and maybe it's slowed down a bit, so I'll just go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next installment of the Bench2Market talk series. This talk will be about FDA regulatory strategy. So my name is Courtney Law. I'm the Managing Director of Biolocity, and our Bench2Market talk series is co-sponsored by Biolocity, the Georgia CTSA, and the Pettit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to share a little bit of background about our series, as well as share some upcoming funding opportunities. As I mentioned, we are a part of a talk series. So our what I'm displaying now is the calendar for this year. You can always see our calendar at the Biolocity website, as shown here. So biolocity.godtech.edu at Bench2Market. And our next topic will actually be on February 16th at a new time. So instead of our normal 11:30, this will be held at 1 p.m. And this will cover CMS and reimbursement codes. So if you join this, you'll learn a little bit more about establishing a viable business model through reimbursement. And our speaker, Teresa Wilson, will present the reimbursement riddle, how to transform a device into dollars. Topics that she'll include includes insurance coverage rules, coding, and payment using the Medicare program as a model. So I think it'll be a great talk, and you can register at our website following our biolocity.godtech.edu events. Some other resources that are available to you all, some other commercialization resources. Biolocity offers complimentary counseling and materials to Emory University and Georgia Tech innovators. So that includes faculty, staff, students, and alums, and any startup companies that are related to either institution. So one of the things that we are offering is legal office hours in partnership with Emory School of Law. If you're interested, please make an appointment at our website. A few funding opportunities that we wanted to make you aware of. So right now, the NIH is having an NIH Tech Accelerator Challenge for maternal health. They are seeking to spur and reward the development of prototypes in more of the point of care, low cost technology realm. The 4 priority conditions right now are around infection, hypertensive disease, hemorrhage, and placental issues. If you are interested in learning more, please visit their website at venturewell.org/NTAC. And you have to register for the challenge by April 1st. Another set of opportunities that we wanted to share with you are around the BARDA Easy BAAs. We do try to monitor these quite frequently. So there are a couple of new areas of interest that they are looking for. I've displayed the list here. These typically are up to $750,000 worth of grants, sometimes more. But if you're interested in learning more about any of these opportunities, please feel free to contact my team, and we can talk to you a little bit more about the application process. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Grace Powers, our speaker for today, and she'll be talking about FDA regulatory strategy in the medical device and digital health realm. A little bit about Grace. She's an independent regulatory affairs consultant. She founded Powers Regulatory Consulting in 2015 to help clients with regulatory strategies and submissions. Her clients have included universities, investors, startups, and mid-sized medical device companies. And she often works with the Biolocity team and other folks on this call probably. So we're really excited to have her as a speaker today. And following her talk, our Associate Director for Biolocity, John Kosha, will moderate Q&A. I think if you have questions during the talk, please feel to leave them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get them answered. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Grace.
Hi, everybody. Getting my screen set up here so I can see everything. Okay. Someone let me know if there's any issues on the technical side, but hi, everybody. I'm Grace Powers. I'm a regulatory consultant, and I'm going to talk us through today medical device regulation and an overview of digital health as well. So it's a pretty broad topic. I could talk for many hours on a lot of these, but I've picked a couple to kind of talk about today, mostly 510K pathway and pre-submissions. So background wise, Courtney went over it. I worked in industry for quite some time before becoming a regulatory consultant and working with multiple companies. So let's go ahead and get started. So I always have to start everything off with the definition of a medical device. I spend a lot of time helping clients determine if they fall into this category. It's a bit of antiquated wording, and I'm certainly not going to read it all to you guys, but medical device is often a thing, as I describe it: instrument, apparatus, implement, software, article, something along those lines, that is intended to affect the structure or function of the body, but not through a chemical action. A chemical action would typically be a pharmaceutical or biologic type product. In vitro diagnostics have their own definition. And so those are some of the things that we think about, like with our COVID testing and things like that that are going on right now. They're not necessarily an invasive product, but typically take a sample from the body to get some information about a person. So let's start off with medical device regulation and classification. So there's 3 classes for medical devices. I'm sure some of you on there know this, but I've updated some of the numbers. FDA published some new numbers recently, so it's always good to see the amount of products that fall in these categories. So Class 1 devices are our lowest risk devices. Malfunction, misuse generally doesn't cause any issues or any, risk to life or anything. You can see a tongue depressor there. We all have toothbrushes. We all have Band-Aids. We all have some of these lower risk devices, sunglasses, things like that. There's a lot of things that are around in the Class 1 category. It makes up about 35% of medical devices. Class 2, 53%, which has gone up in the last few years. There's more Class 2 devices overall now, are moderate risk. So if there was a malfunction or something went wrong, there could be some harm. It's unlikely that it's life-threatening, but there is harm in there, and they are devices that typically FDA likes to review. The highest risk device is a Class 3 device. These are life-sustaining, life-supporting, novel implants, things along those lines, and they make up about 9% of medical devices. So bringing a Class 3 product to market is an extensive amount of work in clinical studies, and that's kind of a smaller proportion of devices. So the classification really drives what type of FDA submissions are required, or if an FDA submission is required. So the way that FDA sets up your requirements on what you have to do is based on this classification. So there's general controls, which is some very basic requirements, quality systems, things like that. We'll talk through that in a minute. There's special controls, which is kind of another level up that talks about FDA reviewing your technical information in a submission, certain requirements for types of testing and things along those lines. Those are generally required for Class 2 products. And then pre-market approval, which is a much longer process where FDA reviews not only your technical information, but also your systems and things along those lines. Manufacturing information are Class 3 products. So those are the highest risk ones. And we'll talk through some of these. With everything that I talk about today in FDA, there's exceptions to every rule. So there'll be some differences between things, but the majority of things fall into these categories where there's kind of no FDA submission for Class 1. It's typically a 510K class submission for Class 2 and a PMA submission for Class 3. So general controls. So everybody has to do this. Most medical devices have to do this. You have to do your establishment registration of your company. So you have to tell them that you're making a medical device. You have to tell them that the category it's in. You have to just register with FDA so they know who and where you are. So of course you have to pay to do that. So the fee for 2022 is $5,500. You have to pay that every year. No reduction for small businesses, but this is something that you're not doing until you are marketing your first product. You're actually selling it and putting it into interstate commerce. Device listing is just telling them the type of category. Generally, your product has to be made with good manufacturing practices. So you need to know, where your components are coming from. Generally, a lot of the basics of manufacturing. You have to be labeled with FDA regulations, and then most of the time there's no technical submission to FDA, but again, exceptions to every rule. Here's some examples of class 1 devices. Some gloves are class 1 devices, stethoscope, here's a sling. A glove is one of the ones that falls into the non-exempt odd category, because if somebody has a glove that they're expecting to protect them from a disease or a chemical or whatever it is, and it doesn't work as intended, then there is risk out there for that user. Sometimes the risk is to the patient, sometimes the risk is to the clinician. So both of those are always considered. Just an example, the Code of Federal Regulation has a lot of device classifications listed in it. So you can see over here, it's section 880, 62, 65, and it has some definitions. This is just an example showing that this class 1 gown is a class 1 and that it doesn't have to do a lot of the requirements there. So that's one way to look up some of the requirements. Class 2 is where it gets more interesting. So this is where just saying good manufacturing and things isn't quite enough to show that the device is safe and effective. FDA is going to do a review on it. There'll be standards out there to follow, guidance documents, labeling requirements, and then following along with complaints and making sure that your device is being used as intended and not causing harm out in the field. Generally, these require a 510K. Here's some examples. This is the majority of, I guess, the devices that FDA reviews are in class 2, spirometer, X-ray, there's a Foley catheter, things like that kind of fall into the class 2 category. And we'll talk about 510Ks more in a minute. Here's another example just from the Code of Federal Regulation. This is just a cardiovascular guide wire. It has the definition of it and says that it needs to do performance testing and meet certain performance standards. In order to kind of find standards and guidance documents, there's a lot of FDA databases that are out there to figure out what's applicable to your potential product. Of course, the standards you have to buy from various places, but the FDA guidance documents are out there. There's a guidance document database. I'll say this a few times throughout the presentation, the FDA databases, they do have all the information, but their own search functions are pretty out of date, and it's a little bit rudimentary how you get the information. So it's better to download Excel sheets and things and download all their databases and search it yourself, or just use Google, because it doesn't always pull up in the way that I think we're used to all the searches pulling up to. So pre-market approval is for class 3 products. So we're talking about the highest risk products here that have the most requirements associated with them. These are ones that would definitely cause harm if they didn't work as intended, and they're often life-sustaining. There's an LVAD, and there's stents, there's a breast implant. These are all considered high-risk devices, and generally these high-risk devices only make up 9% of all the devices that are out there, but they definitely take the most work for sure. Here's an example that I think is just an interesting one that someone asked me to share another time I did a presentation. And it's a little bit talking about what you say about your medical device, and what these claims are can really drive the classification of your device, right? So this is a good example, rigid gas permeable contact lenses. So you can see kind of in the middle of the slide here, that if the device is only intended for daily wear, so class 2, put the contact in my eye, trash it at the end of the day, it's a class 2 product. If it's intended for extended wear, it's a class 3 product. And if we were there in person, I would quiz you on why you think that is, but that's a little challenging to do on here. So it's class 3 because you're using it, it's touching the body longer, but it also has to be stored, it has to be disinfected, it has to be reused. There's a lot of testing and usability and disinfection type work that has to be proven, and a lot more things can go wrong or more harm caused if you're using the contact over and over and over again versus just putting it in clean from the package and getting rid of it that day. So that's kind of an example about claims. And so talking about claims, this is a question that I get a lot. Maybe you have a product that's going through the 510K process, but there's certain things for your business that you want to be able to say about it. So what is a claim? To me, there's no official FDA definition for a claim. People work them into their submissions. They're included in people's marketing material. A claim to me is scientific information about a medical device. You always have to have documentation to back that claim up. If a product is substantially equivalent to a predicate device, then the claims have to be considered. You can't say your device is necessarily better because that's not something that you're proving. You've proved equivalence through that submission. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But I had an example from a friend from long ago that you can see on here where there is a plasma surgery system and it's indicated for the removal of soft tissue. They wanted to update it to say it could remove a tumor or something cancerous, but that would potentially raise the classification because that's something that would have to be proven clinically. So to get onto the market and get started, they were only talking about soft tissue versus a specific disease state or a specific type of product to use that. So that's kind of the overview on classifications. There are a lot of different types of FDA submissions, and 45 minutes of me chatting is not going to cover them all. So I kind of flipped through some of the comments that you guys had put in. I always talk about 510Ks since that's most common. And a couple people talked about pre-submissions too. So I'm going to talk about those two today, and then we'll go into digital health. So 510K. So if you've ever heard me talk before, you've heard me say before that the 510K process is not a completely logical process, in my opinion, but it is what it is. And so we'll talk about it a little bit and help kind of demystify some of the things that are around that. So this is a submission. It's a technical submission that has all the technical information, testing, labeling, information about the product, not necessarily about manufacturing, not necessarily about quality systems, specific to one product that you're doing the submission on. And you have to demonstrate that this product is substantially equivalent to a predicate device. And a predicate device is a similar-ish legally marketed device that also went previously through the 510K process. So this is a basic example up here of a balloon catheter. So you look at them, they're similar. I mean, they have a little bit of a different configuration. They have a different color. They could be a different size, but we would imagine that these have the same intended use to do whatever it may be in the vessel. They have some different technological characteristics, like different size, different color, maybe different material. And so we have to take this new device here more in the middle and show that it's as safe and as effective as the predicate device. And that's not always easy to do. Some Me Too type products are more straightforward than others. But that's something that I love helping clients with, and something that just takes a little bit of work to get figured out. So this is kind of an overview of the 510K process. And I'm going to walk through each of these steps here. So first is device classification. There's about, it's probably bigger now, 1,800 different types of devices, and they're grouped into different panels. So think of these as kind of different departments pretty much at FDA where people have their specialties that they work in. You can see them on here. Some things are obvious, some things cross over in between different groups, but all of these are available on the FDA website and break down each of these different categories on there. So you have to find kind of an area, obviously looking at your competitors and looking at other products that are similar to yours. You can find their FDA information to see how they're classified, but I like to kind of start at the top here and work into each of these, especially if it's not clear which group things fall into, and some cross over multiple groups. This is my favorite picture that demonstrates the 510K process. So I always call it the pepper picture. And so you look at these and they're all peppers. Like that's their category. They all fall into peppers, but they all look different. They're different colors, they're different sizes, they're different shapes, but they're pretty much probably substantially equivalent to each other, right? They're still all peppers. They're just different flavors and types. So determining the predicate doesn't mean it necessarily has to be identical. So it either has to have kind of the same intended use with the same characteristics, kind of like that balloon catheter did, or it can have the same intended use that's already out there. That's kind of the highest level thing that needs to match with something that's out there, and different characteristics. And then you're going to explain to FDA in this 510K why these different characteristics don't raise new questions of safety and effectiveness. And they're as safe and as effective as the product that's on the market. So maybe they're different materials, but you did testing to show that your material is safe too. That's a different technological characteristic, but you can prove that it's okay. Different energy, you can see the list here at the bottom. Chemical composition, maybe different manufacturing process. This is battery powered. This is plugs into the wall, things like that. So you have to go through those different areas and show your safety and effectiveness, and also compare it to the predicate device. So finding a predicate device, when I help people find a predicate device, I want to know all your competitors, who's able to say some of the claims that you want to say, what other products are out there. The FDA databases are helpful. Google is your best friend when it comes to these type of things, and even searching the FDA databases. It's really kind of knowing your market and knowing what's out there and how you're similar and how you're different to products that are already out there. Once you've kind of identified products, typically you can find there is public information, a summary for each 510K, at least in the last 20 years that's out there, probably 25 years online. Some of the older ones, they don't have online summaries, but that you can look at to also get a feel for what, that device is like and what their official indications and official description is. So drafting the 510K. So drafting the 510K is really including a lot of the information about the predicate device, your classification, final labeling, so instructions for use, the label on the product. Oops, sorry. Letting people in as they show up on my screen. Specifications, so like an engineering drawing, a photo. You want to tell the story of your product and why it's safe and effective. And if I'm an FDA reviewer and I can't understand what your product is, I'm going to have many, many questions. So including a lot of descriptions on how it's used, how I would interact with a device. Am I a clinician that's doing a surgery? Am I a patient that's at home using an app? Really explaining how to interact with that device, including photos, including screenshots, whatever it is, so that the reviewer can really understand the product is a big, important piece of it. Bench testing, animal studies, clinical studies, sterilization information, all of those if applicable. are in there. If there's guidance documents and standards, those should be referenced and say, I looked at this guidance document and these were the applicable tests and I did them all and here's my results. Again, there are guidance documents. There's a couple thousand of them. I don't know how many there are for devices, but there's pretty much a guidance document for everything and every type of test. So making sure that those are referenced and that you're providing the information to FDA that they expect to see. There's a biocompatibility one. There's a EMC one that says this is how we want you to write the 510K and put this information in this order. And although sometimes cumbersome, it's definitely helpful to cut down on questions and things at the end. So the typical 510K is made up of 20 sections. It's been in this format for forever. They're trying to update it, but there's a lot of resistance and it hasn't happened quite yet. Some of these are very small areas and certifications and things that are required. The big areas are 11 and 12, 11 where you talk about your device and provide all that information I was just talking about. And then 12, substantial equivalence, is where you really talk about your predicate. And then the rest is, labeling and testing. Okay, submitting your 510K. So this is a little bit about the timeline associated with it. We are still sending submissions in on DVD or USB through the mail to the Document Control Center at FDA. We're almost there, but we're still mailing them in. So that takes a day. There's a very specific format that you mail it in called an e-copy. FDA takes that down. You don't have to send a hard copy anymore. We were able to ditch hard copies about 3 years ago now, which again is probably a little bit late, but nice that we're not killing too many trees. So they acknowledge the receipt of that, usually the day it gets checked in typically. By around day 15, there's a checklist for the FDA reviewer. I like to rewrite the checklist and put it in the submission and tell them where everything is in my submission so nothing gets held up. But it's called the refuse to accept list, where they can refuse to accept your submission because it doesn't have some of the content that they know is needed to review it. And that can stop the clock. The overall clock for a 510K is 90 days. That's 90 days where I always say the ball is in FDA's court. So they're reviewing it for 90 days, but when content is missing, that clock stops. So it typically takes 3 to 6 months overall for a 510K to get a clearance. But usually around day 60. So you've made it through the refuse to accept at day 15. It's pretty quiet. Around day 60, you get a list of your substantive review is what they call it. It's a additional information notification request where they have a list of all the questions about your submission. And you do get all your questions back at once, different topics, everything at once. So if you have some biocompatibility questions, some testing questions, you'll get all those questions in one letter back from your FDA reviewer. The clock then stops and you have to answer those questions. Sometimes they're not a big deal. Sometimes they're deep and they take additional testing or even additional discussion with FDA to get through. Once that's done and FDA has reviewed those questions, you mail them back in on the DVD to the mail center. Once that's complete, you may have some interactive questions over email, smaller things, make this label update the information that'll be public about your 510K summary. But typically you get a decision around day 90. The decisions that come are your clearance so that you are substantially equivalent. It's not an approval, it's a clearance. It's technically the correct terminology for a 510K or not substantially equivalent. That if you were to the point where you were going to be getting a not substantially equivalent, there would be a lot of conversations and it probably wouldn't be a surprise from your questions from FDA. And there's also an option to withdraw your submission, which some people choose to do. If you withdraw your submission, you don't necessarily get your dollars back for your review fee, but some people choose to do that versus getting the non-substantially equivalent. I think I hid my slide trying to be quick about the cost for the 510Ks. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. It's about $13,000 for the user fee, but if you are a small business, I think it's about $4,000, and you can get an FDA small business designation, which requires a previous year tax return. So you would have to have a tax return for the business showing that your revenue is under like $30 million a year, and then you can qualify for the small business fees. I can look that up if anyone has questions about it. So the next area I'm going to talk about is pre-submission. So I saw a couple of people had questions about pre-submissions on the list of topics. So what is a pre-submission? It is kind of what it sounds like. It's a submission before the official submission. So you would do this probably before a 510K or before a de novo or another type of FDA submission. So the formal definition is here: formal written request from a submitter for feedback. The way that I think of it is you're writing to FDA to discuss, certain topics that pertain to your future submission. So you're going to be asking them maybe about your indication or your predicate device are two that I like to do. You might want them to review a animal study protocol before you do the testing because it's very expensive, things like that. So formal written feedback, there's no user fee. So it's a free submission, which is nice, especially for smaller companies. You can get your feedback. In-person meeting is my favorite type. FDA hasn't been open to in-person meetings, and obviously COVID times and probably won't be for some times, but it is nice to have, hallway conversations and things with your FDA reviewers. Unfortunately, that's not an option. So it's just a teleconference, or you can just get written feedback where you don't necessarily have to talk about it. I always recommend talking about it with FDA because they'll always give you insight. They are people too, and are typically pretty helpful in these meetings. They're confidential. They're not able to be disclosed publicly. So if you don't want someone knowing what your company's up to, you can still do this pre-submission, and it's not, it remains confidential. It takes about 70-ish days to get your feedback. So you write up the submission, and then they have about 2 months to review it. So I've actually done entire webinars just on pre-submissions for an hour. So one of the main questions that I brought over to this one is, why would I do a pre-submission? And it's just helpful to me. FDA has their own answers that you can see up here. Early interaction and careful consideration of FDA's feedback may improve the quality of subsequent submissions and shorten review times, et cetera. But really, it provides valuable feedback for your company. It's one way to make sure you understand your regulatory pathway forward. You understand if there's something that's a little bit in a gray area on how to proceed. FDA can give their thoughts on that. I think it gives valuable feedback for investors. I've seen multiple investors that just want FDA letterhead on something to show that the interaction has started and to kind of validate the pathway to move forward. And it's definitely a good idea when it comes to just various financial things. Like I said before, the animal study, you don't want to go do $100,000 animal study and then FDA didn't like, the drugs that were given for coagulation when you were measuring something cardiac related. So you definitely want to be on the same page with some of those more expensive studies, and FDA will review the protocols and give feedback. When is it an appropriate time to do it? In my opinion, when it'll help the product move forward. Like I said, some of these other areas, defining your clinical study design, defining your predicate, looking at your bench testing. If your company is far enough along that you could go ahead and do your 510(k) submission, I would not wait to do a pre-submission. I would do it in the earlier stages of development. I wouldn't let it hold up any timelines or any paid, more official submissions to market a product. You would still get your feedback, maybe not at the ideal time, but you would still get your feedback during the review process and when you get your questions from FDA. The feedback is not binding, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad for a lot of different scenarios. I've had pre-submissions that are years before, and it's a different group of people with a different thought, and some of the information isn't the same. There's also been some that we've not taken the advice and it's been okay in the end. So sometimes it's good that it's not binding. Goes both ways. So my next slides kind of talk about the latest related to digital health. And I'm going to go through just a couple of topics there. And then we'll be able to do some questions and things. I realize I go so much faster when I'm not actually talking to people during standing in a classroom. So the latest when it comes to digital health, FDA is trying to keep up with the times and put out a lot of information on digital health, which is a pretty broad term. In 2020, we had the 21st Century Cures Act, where certain medical devices, medical software more, things that you think of like EMRs and certain, there's a million different apps that you can get on your phone and all these different areas. They kind of have started putting out guidance and talking about things that are not considered medical devices or that they don't choose to regulate. So doing this act put out a bunch of different areas and a bunch of different guidance documents. So this is kind of FDA's definition of digital health and some of the areas that it falls into. So you can kind of see the sub-bullet list, but these are a lot of the areas. So mobile medical apps, software as a medical device, clinical decision support software, machine learning and AI. They also have a group, medical device data systems, and then general wellness products. Those are kind of the main categories that all have individual guidance documents that describes FDA's thinking on things that fall into general, these areas. Like, for example, general wellness is like you think your Fitbit. It measures heart rate. Heart rate is a medical signal, but FDA is choosing not to regulate that as a medical device. Having heart rate on there is just for general wellness, and it's just that. When you move into like an Apple Watch that's going to start to have like ECG and start to look for arrhythmias, then that's when it becomes a medical device. So some of these kind of help define that those different levels. So I think I have a slide on each of them, and we'll walk through those and then we can move to questions. So mobile medical apps can be executed on basically a mobile platform. So any app that you would think of. They can also include accessories that attach to your smartphone or to other devices. And then really over the last few years, it's evolved to also just include anything that's kind of on an internet browser that you can access without any sort of special, device or something like that is part of this now. So let's see. Mobile medical apps, software application that's on the mobile platform. They meet the definition of a medical device and are either intended as an accessory to a regulated medical device or to transform a mobile platform into a regulated medical device. So basically this guidance document talks about if you're using the light on the back of your iPhone to measure, SO2 or something from your finger, that's a medical device. If you're using it to write down what you ate every day, or maybe to write down, your glucose measurement every day, if you're diabetic, that's not really a medical device. That's a convenient way to track information. So it's a long guidance document that talks through things. It also points over to some other areas where there is software as a medical device. So you guys can think of all the different cloud-based software. Maybe you're uploading a medical image and it's doing some calculation or processing of it, things like that. That is considered a medical device. And there's a guidance document that talks about what the requirements are when you're software that runs on a standard platform versus software that runs on custom hardware, like a more traditional device, like you would probably think of. Let's see. Yeah, so this has some examples on here at the bottom using the microphone of the smart device to detect breathing during sleeping. Things like that is still considered a medical device. An area that I've touched on a lot and I've seen a lot of companies in is what's called clinical decision support software. And these are convenient, smart apps that provide information to a clinician or to a patient, depending on what it is, to help just with clinical decisions. So there's a certain set of criteria here that it has to meet to be a clinical decision support tool. And if it meets this criteria, then FDA is choosing not to regulate it as a medical device. And so we don't necessarily have to go through that, but this is something that I go through with people a lot. It can't have a medical image, like a medical image or a signal. It's not processing that. That doesn't fall in this category. It's just having medical information. So think about a very long clinical practice guideline where you could have a book in front of you that you're, choose your own adventure, go to page 30 to read about this, go here. Now it's just automated. You're clicking through it to help you make a decision. You're entering a list of known symptoms that may lead to a known diagnosis, but the software on its own is not diagnosing anything. It's just providing additional support for the physician or clinician that's using it. It'll provide recommendations like this is typically a medication that's used for a patient with this disease state. And one of the keys is this number 4 down here. There can't be a secret black box algorithm to get the answer. Like the healthcare professional has to know, oh, this uses this guideline, these papers, this information to get that clinical decision support. It just can't be a black box or a super deep calculation. In that case, it becomes a regulated medical device. Wanted to touch on artificial intelligence. I don't know that there's really medical devices with true artificial intelligence, but there are very many medical devices that have, or at least the way I even get the definition, that use machine learning to be able to, update software, drive just use machine learning as part of their development process. Actually, just a couple of weeks ago, I think in November, FDA made a database of all 510K products and PMA products that use machine learning. That's pretty interesting. They're mostly like 80% in the radiology category where, they're taking images to determine the best settings for the X-ray or the CT or whatever it may be, but it's kind of an evolving area with FDA. I've just dealt with 1 or 2 submissions with them, and they're a challenge to really understand what the truth of the machine learning algorithm is and get, making sure that the algorithm is being built appropriately and not over radiating or causing additional harm on there. So that's a topic that I would definitely do a pre-submission with FDA about to make sure everybody's on the same page. Let me see. So 2 more categories. So this one, MDDS, medical device data systems, are typically cloud-based systems that transfer information, medical information around, but don't necessarily change anything about it or process the data. So you have an app on your phone, it uploads to your physician's cloud-based software where they can go in and look at things. That's probably an MDDS, and that's not regulated as a medical device. Really just moving a lot of information around, not actively monitoring, just collecting information in portals and things like that. The last one I touched on in the beginning is kind of the general wellness device. Very low risk device, things like exercise equipment, video game for dexterity, things along these lines that aren't related to a specific disease state or anything, or have very basic, like eating less calories leads to weight loss, very well-known high level type things associated with them. And that are just overall known for kind of healthy lifestyle. So like the Fitbit that I talked about, things along those lines, there's something like that that shows that they're really not medical devices. So overall with digital health, these are kind of some of the takeaways. So FDA is still going to use the same risk-based approach. If there is risk to the patient or to the user, whoever it may be, then it may need to be regulated as a medical device. Sometimes it might be considered a medical device, but FDA is still choosing to not necessarily regulate it or require any submissions for it. And FDA is just focused on the ones that obviously do have some risk with them. And that's where they're taking all their submissions and doing most of their work. So, okay, so questions. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can maybe see you guys.
Thanks so much, Grace. So we've got a couple questions in the chat already, and then other people can feel free to jump in as well. The first one, I guess I can just read it aloud to start with. What are the important special regulatory considerations when bringing an international Class 1 product into the domestic or US market? And asking if there are any other resources or experts that might be helpful in that process as well.
I mean, the same requirements are there for coming in, international products coming into the US. If they have, a lot of other countries kind of piggyback off of US approval or CE marking in Europe. So if they have those, if they already have a CE mark, probably all of the systems are in place. You do have to have a US agent, I think is the formal terminology, where you have somebody available in the US and representing your company in the US, in case there's questions or things come up, they would be able to contact you. But otherwise, it's still the same US requirements. And there's a lot of international companies that do 510Ks and pre-submissions in all these areas.
Great, thanks. Another question, this is also a question that I had. You mentioned that for some digital health technology, some software, they may not actually consider it a medical device, or they might not consider it something that they regulate. How would you sort of get that opinion from them? Would that come about through a pre-sub or some kind of other interaction? How would you kind of make that determination that your technology wouldn't need clearance?
It's a good question. There's a couple of different ways. Typically, you hire someone to give an opinion. I've seen companies that are on the edge hire like myself and other people, so they have multiple independent reviewers to say that they don't believe it's a medical device. It's a little bit tough to do a pre-submission if you don't have a 510K or a de novo or a pre-sub in the future, because you can't get a device classification through a pre-submission. Technically, there's another process of 513G where you can get a device classification. You typically get a pretty conservative answer if you do that. So reaching out to kind of the digital health groups, depends on the product and the situation, but like reaching out to the digital health group at FDA may be helpful. I've had good responses. Sometimes I've had no responses sometimes. So it's a little bit tough, but you'd have to be persistent to really get that, or really feel comfortable with the logic behind the write-up as to why you're not considered a medical device.
Got it, thanks. And maybe following up on that, are there any conversations or types of meetings that are binding with the FDA? You mentioned that a pre-sub typically is not. Are there any interactions that people should be kind of careful about, making some sort of binding?
The 513G classification process, that's the paid submission to get the classification, I believe is binding, but it's binding in the sense that the way you described your device in that submission, if your submission is 2 or 3 years later, you have different features, different materials, different whatever it may be, then it may not be as applicable. But generally starting that conversation, that's probably where you're gonna end up. So you want to make sure you have a good description and good suggestion for classification if that's something that the business chooses to do.
Got it. Thanks. Another question we got is about sort of the overlap between IP and regulatory path. So this person mentioned that there is the potential for some prior art for patents, an interesting crossover with some of the predicate info you present to the FDA. Have you ever encountered that in your work, that there might be some IP considerations with your conversations with the FDA, or any of the I guess information that might eventually become publicly available?
That's a tough one, because I actually don't like looking at any of the IP information when it comes to regulatory, because if you're on the 510K pathway, you do not want to be unique. You want to have a predicate device that matches to you. So, but then seeing, participating in team meetings and seeing other sides of the business beyond regulatory, I have seen where people have updated designs or change things for IP reasons. But when it comes to kind of the regulatory piece, you don't necessarily want to be unique in anything. So it's a little different there. And there's nothing in any FDA submissions that relates to the patent work or any other background. They're very separated when it comes to those kind of federal offices.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. One other question that I had, I think earlier in your talk, you mentioned that the classification of a device isn't just dependent on the characteristics of the device itself, but also its intended use. So I think you brought up the example of the plasma jet device that might be class 2 for certain indications, but then class 3 if you were going to use it for like cancer or something like that. So for that kind of reclassification, what does that process look like? Like, what additional data would you need to show to the FDA? Can you rely on anything that was involved in the class 2 clearance for that? What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, I mean, there are devices where you want to update your claim to a specific disease state that takes very specific clinical information. From a technology like technical testing, performance testing standpoint, I mean, if you're doing 60601 electrical safety testing, it's applicable to your class 2 product. It would also be applicable to a class 3. So it would probably, depending on, the business, it would start with a general indication for, I always call it a tool. So you have a plasma jet that, I forget, cuts soft tissue. So the clinician decides what to do with it and who it's going to work on and how they're going to use it. That's kind of what I think of as the tool. If you're going to get more specific and say that you're going to have good outcomes in a specific disease state, so I'm going to be able to take away the tumor, that's something that has to be proved clinically. So you would be doing a new PMA submission for that. You would probably resubmit all the information, even though some of the basic performance testing might be identical. The crux of the review is going to be based on that clinical study that's going to look at that new area and new labeling and things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We also got another question to speak a little bit about the emergency use process, which is maybe something that we've all heard a bit more about during the pandemic. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the emergency use process?
I don't have a lot of thoughts on the process. I actually decided March 2020 that I was not going to do any emergency use work because I already had a lot of other work to do. What I've understood is it's a bit more collaborative, especially on products that FDA sees would be very helpful very quickly. There's a lot of templates and a lot of information, and FDA has revised and put out templates more for EUAs in the last 2 years than ever. So there's pretty good information out there for that. It seems like it moves relatively quickly. I heard about a lot of people getting a no in the beginning, and now at this point, 2-ish years into the pandemic, like FDA is publishing guidances on what you need to do when your EUA runs out. So people are still having to follow up with a 510K if you want to keep commercializing your mask or your glove or whatever it may be. Like, I don't know a lot about the IVD space and the COVID tests, so they may be somewhere else, but at least in the PPE world, there's a deadline. I think it's May or June this year to get your regular submission in if you want to keep marketing your product. So EUAs are running out of time.
I just want to comment on that, John. We do at Emory work a lot on EUAs, actually, specifically for diagnostics, COVID diagnostics. And I just want to echo what you said, Grace, is that the process is much more of a conversation versus a strict, because they're taking into account really fast evolving data, particularly as variants come along. So they've actually taken a much more collaborative approach. It's less, submit your data into a black box, and more, let's talk about the data that you have and see if it fulfills the need. They are also considering scarcity and material scarcity versus just safety and effectiveness. So that is something that I don't think is very common for the FDA, but that is part of the EUA algorithm now.
Yeah, and there are products that are already marketed where there's the scarcity issue, partially COVID, partially just supply chain and all the things that are going on in the world, that there are instances where if you can prove that COVID-19 is one of the reasons that you're having to make this change to your product or having to update this material or whatever, there's a little bit more discussion and leeway than there was before, where it was just like, you're a business that needs to change it, like pay for your review and we'll review it in the right time frame. There's a little bit more flexibility now. A lot's probably too much, but a little bit more.
Depends on how scarce the thing is.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for that context, Morgan and Grace. So we've got a couple minutes left. Please feel free to drop another question in the chat. I've got a quick one, or maybe a quick one. For a product that has gone through the process and got, let's say, 510K clearance, what kind of like post-market surveillance does the FDA do? How do they kind of keep track of a product that's received clearance and monitor any potential issues like that?
Yeah, so like we talked about on the slide with the general controls. So you have your very first 510K clearance. Once you are ready to commercialize your product, which for a lot of people is not the day after they get 510K clearance, it's when they have inventory built up and things figured out, or salespeople, whatever it may be. You register and list your product. So when you register, they know who you are and where you are. When you list your product, you actually link that 510K and say, this is the product that I'm selling. This is like the brand and proprietary name that it's under. So then FDA knows you exist and that you're marketing this product. And when you're marketing the product, that's when you are looking at some of your post-market activities from your quality system. Like you have to be able to take complaints. You have to follow up, appropriately, or investigate and track things. That's kind of when that part, I guess, kicks into it, to make sure your product's working the way that it's intended and things like that. I mean, FDA is supposed to routine audit everybody every 2 years, but in reality, that doesn't necessarily happen. They're routinely auditing the higher risk products that are known to have issues, maybe products that somebody's complained a lot about. Clinicians as well as industry have to turn in medical device reporting if there's an incident where harm has occurred, or maybe it wasn't major harm, but harm could have occurred because of an issue. You're notifying FDA. And so if you have a lot of those, then they might show up.
Awesome. Thanks. That makes sense. All right. We are just about at time. So I want to give one last thank you to our speaker, Grace. Thanks so much for a really informative talk. And I guess I'll leave you with one more plug to please check out our next Bench2Market talk next month. We'll be talking about reimbursement. So more on the kind of business models for medical devices. But thanks again, Grace.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.